Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. I'm Philip Ideson, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement, advisor to procurement leaders around the world, and the founder and managing director of Art of Procurement. My team and I work with our global network of subject matter experts to help companies elevate procurement's impact, whether that's through building and implementing transformation programs, sustainably reducing external expenses, or leveraging AOP Mastermind, our learning and development platform for companies of all sizes. You're listening to our flagship podcast, where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their results with the needs of the business. Hey there everybody, and welcome to episode 318 of The Art of Procurement. And if you've listened to the show before, you'll notice that we have a new sound. I thought 5 years in, it was probably a time to really freshen things up a little bit around here. Also, I'm going to start sharing my big takeaway from each episode's conversation, so listen to the end of the show for today's takeaway. And today I actually wanted to share with you my conversation with Canda Rozier. Canda is a multiple-time CPO across a number of leading global organizations. Recently, she started her own procurement consulting firm, Collabra Consulting. I'm proud to say that I've known Canda for a number of years and was delighted to be able to welcome her onto the show today. Last week on the pod, you may recall, I created a special series that was focused on helping us all prepare for the expense management and cost reduction challenges that many of our organizations are looking towards procurement to lead. And so this week, I wanted to come back to a topic that is equally as important, and that is positioning procurement as a business partner. Well, our ability to forge trusted relationships, it's going to be so important, not only to maximize the impact of our work today, but also to position procurement as a long-term business partner, rather than a tool just to bring out the toolbox whenever cost savings are needed. And this is an approach really that Canda has taken all the way through her career. So in today's conversation, we dig into the tactics and strategies that she has used to build high-performing procurement teams. And I started with my normal question, asking Canda if she found procurement or if procurement found her.
That's an interesting question. I would almost say I stumbled onto it.
Mm-hmm.
By way of background, I had a liberal arts education, which of course didn't particularly ready me for much of anything,
didn't scream
but
procurement.
For everything, I would say.
Yeah,
definitely not procurement. I spent the early part of my career working for a then large global computer company, doing application programming of all things.
Okay.
And that sort of segued me into product management. And I was now, a bit into my career. I was at First Data Corporation, and I was in a business product management role. And I was asked to assist the legal department with some vendor contract negotiations. Yeah. I'm not actually sure why they asked me to.
Right.
And I quickly realized I loved it.
Yeah.
It was fun, and apparently I was really good at it. And it was about a year or so later that First Data decided to, quote, leverage their purchasing power across a number of subsidiaries that they had acquired. And I was one of two people that was asked to set up the first procurement department at First Data. So it wasn't by design particularly, but it was absolutely the place for me. And that's been a long time ago, and I'm still doing it and still loving it.
Yeah, once you got pulled in, sucked into the profession, it's one of those things that, I think so many of us feel. You get pulled in, you have really no idea what procurement is, and then you love it so much that you can't leave. And then here we are, later in our career, and a profession that we love.
Absolutely, and I wouldn't have. I couldn't have wished for it to turn out any differently from a career perspective.
Now, when we think of procurement, and how procurement's evolving, you mentioned at the beginning there, it was, let's leverage our spend, code for centralizing everything and trying to get as much cost savings as we possibly can. But obviously we've evolved a lot, or a lot of organizations have evolved a lot. I just wonder if you could share a little bit about kind of from a procurement perspective and some of our goals and opportunities and targets. What is it that you're most passionate about that you try and bring to each role in terms of the value that procurement brings?
I think that the biggest thing for me, and for me the mark of achievement for myself, for team members, and for the function as a whole, is to be viewed as a valued, trusted advisor and partner to the business. And without a doubt, savings is a part of that.
Yeah.
No matter what we want to think, savings is probably the biggest part of that because it's the most visible. But being able to be seen by the business as that valued partner that has the so-called seat at the table, that's viewed strategically, not just tactically, and is viewed as not just helping transact, which equals getting the goods and saving or services and saving the money, but also providing insights, strategic value, being part of everything from due diligence, acquisitions, mergers, divestitures, to part of a whole product or services life cycle.
Yeah. Now, as you mentioned, you talked about a lot of value levers there that procurement can pull, and I completely agree in terms of how what the opportunities are for procurement in providing value, that while they do include savings, they obviously go way beyond savings. And I wonder if you have some approaches or philosophies or whatever it may be that you take to actually kind of dig beyond savings to understand what a business really wants, really needs from procurement. Because that's really, to me, the key of how do we shape our value prop, is going beyond what may be a high level metric to understand what they really want.
Phil, I think the first thing is that procurement needs to approach the relationship with the internal stakeholders from the perspective that procurement is it's only there, it only exists to service internal client.
Yep.
And that we're not there because frankly anybody wants us.
Yep.
We're almost like a utility. And therefore what you want to be is the best value add that you can. And so with each stakeholder being able to establish rapport, being able to establish credibility, and probably credibility first, and that helps create the rapport. Being able to demonstrate that procurement is not there to try to make decisions for stakeholder. My experience is that when procurement comes in and tries to tell an internal business person what it is they should buy or how they should go about doing it, even if the procurement person's right, you've gotten off on the wrong foot.
Right.
The business person, the internal stakeholder, is the one that has the requirement. By the way, they're the ones with the money, with the budget, and you almost need to think of them as being your customer. And I think that when procurement starts to view their internal stakeholders as customers and try to treat them as if they were in fact an external customer, if you were in a sell-side environment, you start the relationship positioning it towards success.
I completely agree. We're so passionate at Art of Procurement about positioning procurement as a strategic services business, within a business and not a silo, because as you mentioned, oftentimes folks don't necessarily, they want to go and do their own thing and they see us as being an inhibitor. And only when we truly deeply understand what they want can we start to provide them services ultimately that compels them to want to work with us. Because that's really what we want to aim for, is they want to come to us because they see the value, rather than us trying to push a process or a policy to say, hey, you have to work with us. Absolutely.
And I do believe, by the way, that companies need a firm, whether it's a policy or a top-down commitment that recognizes the necessity of functions like finance and procurement. If a company has things like a no PO, no pay policy, having those as sort of underlying foundation stones is really important. But at the end of the day, if the business doesn't want to work with procurement will be relegated to being just a back office transaction processor. Send out the PO, and not adding value, and not having then that seat at the table, not having a voice or an opportunity to have a voice in the more strategic parts of the business.
Yeah, we often think about, that first impression that you make with a stakeholder, especially when you're trying to build a relationship with the first time, about, every interaction, but certainly at the beginning, you have to be providing value. You can't just show up and present, this is procurement, this is what I do. I wonder if you could, maybe share some ways that you and your teams have been able to kind of make a good first impression, kind of how you approach those meetings, what kind of information you may bring to those meetings so that you're starting the relationship off on a good foot.
I think one of the first things is to approach those first meetings not carrying the big stick, not coming in and saying, I have a mandate and thou shalt use us. If you do, you've lost it immediately. And I actually think that one of the things that procurement people can do to make themselves more successful is to step back for a minute before they have some of these initial meetings and think about when they have had initial meetings with suppliers. When a supplier's come in and met with you for the first time, what are the things that turn you off? What are the things that the supplier does that just started off on the wrong foot? And what are the and we all have those instances where we knew within that first couple minutes when a supplier came in that this had the opportunity and the potential to be a valued supplier partnership. And to go back and think about those things in the context of when procurement has been, quote, the customer, and then turn that around when you go into the meeting with your internal customer. And to me, the first thing is don't come in with preconceived notions to the meeting. Come in full of questions and interest so that you can understand what the requirements are, what the background is. Are there some unique circumstances, some nuances internally or in the industry, maybe in the supply chain, that will drive where your internal customer wants the situation, wants the partnership to go, and that allows procurement then to be responsive as opposed to trying to be dictating.
Yes, it's all about discovery, such as in the sales process. It's really good. I'd never really thought about it as think about how we act in those first supplier meetings, because usually we come into those first supplier meetings skeptical to start with, because it's almost like it's a nuisance meeting. Like, oh, do I really need to take this? I don't have time. And you put the shoe on the other foot. And I'm sure that's what the stakeholders are feeling as well, a lot of times when they have that first meeting with procurement.
It is. And I think if procurement can just remind themselves that they're a supplier and they have to win that trust, and that procurement actually doesn't come in with answers. Or in most cases, they don't. And even if you do think you know the answer, as a good salesperson, you don't come out and just say, "Hey, I know what you need." You let the customer lead themselves to knowing that you're the solution.
Yeah, you can influence them along the way as you learn more about their situation, as opposed to, like you say, showing up and saying this is what you need to do on day one.
Absolutely. And I think another thing that procurement can do that enhances the probability of success is and it's true in any negotiation. Find out what the other side considers winning.
Mm-hmm.
What is the driver for, in this case, the internal shareholder? Is it budget savings? It may truly be a cost question.
Yeah.
It may be a quality question. It may be time. It may be it may be risk management.
Mm-hmm.
It may be that the internal stakeholder has in fact gotten themselves in a bind, whether with a product, whether who knows what it is, and they need help. They don't want to admit, and they may not readily admit that they've gotten themselves in a bind, and they need procurement to help them with a supplier or perhaps with a new supplier to get out of that bind. So I think that coming in with an open mind and really focusing on what does the internal customer say they want, and then what do they really consider as being a success?
Yeah.
And by the way, I would say that's the advice I give to anybody in terms of approaching any negotiation. And in a way, procurement starts off their relationship with the internal stakeholder in a bit of a negotiation.
Right. It's taking away, I really agree, taking away all those assumptions, isn't it? Preconceived ideas that you come in. I remember negotiations I've had with suppliers, where you're always thinking that this is a cost-based negotiation because you think, well, they want to make most money, as much money as possible, and I want to save as much money as possible. The reality is, they may want the logo of working with you, or the opportunity to open in a new geographic location, or lots of other value levers that you have no idea about unless you take a step back and try and understand what's at the heart of, what do they want to get out of this relationship.
And if you understand what the supplier wants, and at some point, procurement is almost a mediator.
Mm-hmm.
That if procurement can start by understanding what the internal customer wants, and then to understand what the supplier wants, procurement often becomes the matchmaker to try to find how to let both sides win, and that's what procurement should always be striving for is win-win outcomes, because that leads to good relationships that can become not just a one-off supplier transaction, but rather that valued partnership with the supplier, which is exactly the same kind of partnership that procurement wants with the internal customer.
Now, how can we go about where there's conflicting goals? Let's say a procurement organization has a single goal, and that's a cost-saving goal, and the needs of the business are certainly not to save money. How do we reconcile that? I think in the way that we're working with the stakeholders at the stakeholder level, like not letting our objectives get in the way, but also then how we're rolling up the value of procurement, the procurement KPIs to senior leadership.
Well, I think that clearly having KPIs that are agreed within the organization, and savings is almost certainly going to be one of those. But I think that as procurement matures in an organization, procurement can present and sell internally that the KPIs need to also include things that are not just savings related.
Right.
So things like vendor risk assessments, vendor risk management, speed to market, being able to leverage R&D ideas where your suppliers are actually helping to input to your product or services development. The softer things that may not fall straight to the bottom of your EBIT or EBITDA, but are still very, very critical. Revenue opportunities. And as procurement can help working with finance and the other leaders to gain recognition for some of these, we'll call it ancillary KPIs, then I think that when there's not always the opportunity to produce a savings, you can start to document and demonstrate where you've brought value in other ways. One of the things that is important for procurement to remember is that the biggest proponent of procurement are the individual internal stakeholders.
Yeah.
And so even if you're not able to deliver big savings on a particular deal, if the internal stakeholder believes that you have brought them value, maybe you provided a competitive edge, you gave them an alternative to a supplier with whom they had some quality or other service delivery issues, those wins, which may not translate to savings, become the things that I've found that the internal stakeholder goes and talks to their colleagues about. They almost expect you to save for them, to bring them savings, to help them maximize their budget. But when procurement is able to bring these other layers of value, those are the things that I've found that the business leaders then almost remember the most.
Yeah.
There's an expectation of savings, but when you can demonstrate the other stuff, that's the one that you hear being talked about, at the coffee pot 3 weeks later.
Yeah, I actually love that you say that, because that's what fundamental to what we advise as well is that you can blow out your savings target and you can still be in a lot of trouble from a procurement perspective and engagement perspective because you've upset everybody in the process, or you can not necessarily meet your savings goals, but you've created all this other value and everyone's talking about you positively. Like you say, you may get all your savings targets, but the conversation in the car to the next meeting or whatever between the CEO and the CFO can be about how procurement is not enabling the business. And that's what defines procurement, not necessarily any metrics.
Right. Yeah, it's the measure of success should not be how much glass you break in achieving the goals.
Yeah. So as we think about that role for procurement, then what does that do to the skills? How important does that make the soft skills of a procurement professional as opposed to perhaps the more traditional skills that most of us were taught as we're coming up through the profession?
I personally think that the soft skills are the most critical.
Yeah.
And they are the ones that I think are less easily taught. If I go back to, my background, which I described to you, I didn't know anything about procurement per se. I learned it, and I've learned lots over my career about the fundamentals of procurement and sourcing and contracting. But the soft skills, I believe, are what differentiate really successful procurement professionals.
Yeah.
And that's it's critical thinking skills. It's communication, negotiation, which is we'll call it a subcategory of communication. Yeah. It's an affinity for contracts. Not everybody can read a contract and actually find themselves being immersed in it and honing in on the nuances. And I mean people who are not, legally trained.
Yeah.
So those are the kinds of soft skills, relationship building, being able to, my analogies may fall apart here, but being able to kind of have a zoom lens, if you think of it like on a camera, where you can zoom in for that really focused microscopic view of detail or of a particular nuance, and then zoom back out to the wide angle view.
Yeah.
See the whole picture, see how those nuances that you've zoomed in on, how do they form part of the bigger picture? And the bigger picture is not a procurement picture. It's a business picture.
Yeah, that's so important.
And I think that zooming, that ability to have that zoom lens is a really, really critical thing. I've often found that the team members that I have had over the years who have been the real superstars, almost none of them started out in procurement as a young graduate who said, this is exactly what I want to do.
Yep.
A lot of them had varied backgrounds. They came to procurement with this sort of wealth of experience and soft skills.
So as you think about procurement professionals who have been in the function for a long time, and I'm sure you've had a number of folks like this on your team, like what advice or suggestions do you give them to kind of try and change that mindset? Because it's a mindset as much as it is a skill set, because you're thinking very differently about the world around you than perhaps a very fact-based, data-driven, this is the right thing, so why aren't people doing it approach, which is how a lot of us, me included, kind of grew up in procurement because that's what we're taught.
I think it starts with really an almost a walk the talk approach from procurement leadership that says, here are the values, here's a mission statement.
Yeah.
The goals are strategic. There will be, of course, tactical delivery elements and outcomes that we have to achieve. But I really think that it starts with the leadership of procurement positioning that the goal of procurement and the measures of success are not just going to be quantified KPIs. They'll be part of it, whether it's savings, whether it's number of transactions, turnaround time, that sort of thing. Those are all great and important and critical measures. But to make sure that each team member, even at the most junior levels, have some sort of qualitative goal. And of course, as they progress and as they mature in their career, those qualitative goals, I think, start to become bigger, more visible, and take on a more prominent position. And I've found that in my career that as I look at the really successful team members, they recognize fairly early on that they're comfortable with soft skills.
Yeah.
And you as a procurement management team, recognize which of your team members really have that comfort and that passion and that affinity for soft skills. So there is a little bit of natural selection that occurs.
Yeah.
Some people may not have the soft skills, and by the way, there's great opportunities and requirement for the more strict data science sort of approach in procurement. But I think that's where a procurement leader really has to say, let me understand my employee, let me understand the skills, and then help direct them for where they can be most successful for themselves and thus for the organization.
Yeah, that's really important. Kind of not trying to push them into something that they'll never be. If you're able to architect kind of a structure that gets the most out of them, even if it may be in a support and not a customer facing role or whatever that may be, but not as well just saying, well, this is the kind of skill set you need. And if you don't have that skill set, then, there's no place for you here. Now, like you said, there'll be some natural selection of folks who just don't fit. But on the other hand, there's not having every single skill set doesn't mean that you're not going to have a successful career.
Absolutely not. And particularly, I think, as we see the evolution that's happening within procurement as a function, with the increased use and prevalence of intelligent automation, of RPA, of all of those types of things, there's skills that I think are going to be increasingly required for success in those areas, and they may not be the same skills that we would have for building that internal stakeholder partnership or the supplier partnership relationships.
There's something you said as well that I want to just draw out is, when we're talking about metrics and KPIs, and we talked a little bit about balanced scorecards, but the importance that it is on procurement to change that conversation, not to expect a CFO or a COO or whatever our line of command happens to be to suddenly decide they want something different from us, because we've spent the last 20 years conditioning people to think that cost savings is our only goal. And so they don't even know to ask for something different, I don't think.
Absolutely. And again, that's where I think procurement leaders really need to take the initiative.
Yeah.
Procurement is evolving. Companies are evolving. The business world is evolving, but it's up to procurement leadership to guide the evolution of procurement within their company, within their company's culture, and position how successes or how success may be viewed differently, or how there may be different aspects of success to be viewed. It's a journey.
Yeah.
I don't think it happens overnight for most companies.
No, especially those that are used to looking at procurement in one way. You can't change the perception of what we can deliver overnight, nor would very few CFOs, for example, say on day one, I'm measuring you on corporate cost savings target, or on day two, don't worry about it. We'll go and find some other value measures, but it's one of those things that over time you can perhaps reduce the reliance on one and increase the importance of another metric, another goal.
Correct. Yes, well, I agree completely.
Well, Canda, I want to really, first of all, thank you so much for joining me on the pod today. There's lots of great advice here in terms of really positioning procurement as a services business within a business, as opposed to kind of our traditional way of thinking about procurement as a function, if you will. Now, the easy question I always say at the end is, if folks, if any listeners are listening in, they've enjoyed the conversation and they'd like to reach out directly to you, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Okay. And by the way, Phil, thanks for having me on the pod. This has been great fun. I always love talking about this. The best way for people to reach me is certainly on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And it's Canda Rozier, and I'm the only one, so I'm easy to find. And or it's canda.rozier@gmail.com, and I would be delighted to hear from any listeners and can connect with folks who have the same passion about procurement.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Canda. What I'll do is I'm going to include a link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes for the episode, so folks can go directly to that, click through, and connect with you there. And so that's going to be at artofprocurement.com/podcast, and you're going to find a list of all of our most recent podcasts. You'll find this one with Canda there as well. So, Canda, one last time, thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate it. I want to thank you for listening in to my conversation today with Canda. So my big takeaway that I want to highlight is that your biggest wins may not be the ones that show up in the savings report, but the ones that are talked about at the water cooler. I found that by focusing on business outcomes first, the savings, well, they typically follow, because that earns you the trust to recommend cost savings tactics that can be applied to the project in question, or in another area of spend that your stakeholder has responsibility for. Now, to subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement, and never miss an episode, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe, and you can find our back catalogue of over 300 podcasts from the past 5 years at artofprocurement.com/podcast.